SJC-10911, Commonwealth v. Michael Forte.
Good morning.
Good morning, Your Honors. Kevin Nixon for Michael Forte. I'd like to start by reiterating Mr. Forte's request that he's made in several pro se filings that the court consider carefully what he's filed there, and I know you will, and so on behalf of Mr. Forte and myself, I thank you for that. I also would like to reiterate my motion that was later joined by the Commonwealth that the court order the transmission from the Superior Court to here, Exhibit D that was attached to the motion for a new trial. That exhibit consists of several color photographs that were taken from the security tape that was captured by the camera at the Mass Mutual Civic Center, and I think your review of those photographs will help you understand better some of the issues that are raised here. So, as you know...
Sorry, could I just, is Exhibit D both the Civic Center and the chicken?
No, the chicken is Exhibit 1 at trial.
So we
and I
have those
think
in.
that my sister attached a copy of the Crown Chicken video as an exhibit in the appendix to her brief. So that's also available for the court and may help as well in your review of these issues.
So I'm confused. So there are some things that were filed with the motion for new trial that were never admitted into evidence at the trial?
What those photographs are, Your Honor, is, well, this surveillance video, like a lot of these types of videos, takes pictures 1 second apart. And it's kind of hard to see what's going on until it was easier for me, at least, to understand what was going on by breaking those down into still photographs. And then I presented those with the motion for a new trial that came.
But they were not presented at trial, the still photographs?
No, the still photographs were not presented at trial. They went to Judge Sweeney with the motion for a new trial.
All right, but the security tape itself was presented at trial?
Yes, it was, Your Honor.
So this evidence in one form or another was at trial?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
There were some still photographs at trial, right?
There were some, yes.
Not these.
Not these. I mean, some of these are duplicates of what were admitted at trial. But there's some that were not focused on by the Commonwealth in its presentation of other still photographs, but these do accurately represent portions of the Mass Mutual video that did go in evidence. Now, as I'm sure you know, Mr. Forte represented himself at this trial, and while I acknowledge that Mr. Forte here is not going to be permitted to benefit from that fact by being afforded any standard of review that would be more favorable to him than if he had been represented by counsel, I also know that the case is here on a special standard of review that the court affords first-degree cases like this one, which is more forgiving, and I'm invoking that 33E standard of review at the outset because of my concerns about whether Mr. Forte's handling of his own trial may have resulted in a miscarriage of justice. The case really was about the identification of Mr. Forte by these two young women, Ms. Torres and Ms. Vasquez, at 3 a.m. or so on a street after it had rained all night in Springfield back on a summer night in 2008. They said that they saw him twice, once as he was walking past Crown Chicken, traveling southward on Main Street as he was about to cross State Street, and they were approaching from the other direction on the same side of the street. They said that he was making a lot of angry noises and cursing them, and they, out of fear, crossed the street to get away from him. Walked a little further up Main Street to where there's a bank, looked catty corner across the street and saw that Crown Chicken was closed.
So if I saw that there's somewhere in there a sort of graphic of
there's a map of this
but
area.
Crown Chicken isn't on that map. Unity Bank is.
Right.
But so is Crown Chicken, if I'm getting my directions right, north or south of State Street?
It's north. It's not right on the corner, but it's the one establishment up from the business that is right on the corner of State and Main.
Okay, so it's sort of catty corner from the Unity Bank.
And a little bit north, Your Honor. Yes. So they say they saw him first when he passed, or they moved across the street to get away from this person. And then they said that they went to the Union Bank, they saw what the Crown Chicken was closed, they turned around and proceeded back southward on Main Street, but on the other side, now on the east side of the street, when they saw the person they identified as the same person they had seen earlier, crouching in the street, washing his hands evidently in a puddle that was near where the decedent's body was subsequently found. Now, it's really the second identification of Mr. Forte that provides the linchpin of the government's case, because it's his proximity at that point to the decedent, Mr. Donahue, that is really the chief piece of evidence in the government's case, because they don't have any evidence putting Mr. Forte with the decedent. They don't have any evidence of any prior existing relationship between the two. It's simply his proximity at some remove still from Mr. Donahue that provides them with the main part of their case.
I'm not entirely clear, you may dispute this, but certainly they testified that it's 3 in the morning, they saw nobody else.
Right.
Nobody else except for him.
That's what they said.
Right.
Among the things that are important in the Mass Mutual video, and you'll see it when you see Exhibit D, is that there were other people on the street. And the Mass Mutual video captured several of them. There's a person that you can see on the video in front of Crown Chicken before what arguably is Mr. Forte's silhouette passes in front of that lighted area. There's another person on the other side of the street, on the east side of the street, traveling northward around the same time. The second sighting of the person that the women claimed was Mr. Forte there's no photographic corroboration of that particular identification. It's just they're saying that they saw him.
Did they say how much time passed between the first contact in which he called them whores and sluts and the time they said they saw him in this puddle of water washing his hands?
This is another place where Mr. Forte's handling of this case, I think, creates the likelihood of a miscarriage of justice, Your Honor, because they said they got to the corner, they saw the Crown Chicken was closed, they turned around and started walking the other way. When you look at the Mass Mutual video, you'll see that 2.5 minutes passed between the time they saw him and he was cursing them that way, and that when they reversed direction and started walking.
And is that what they testified to?
No, they testified.
What did they testify
They testified that it happened very quickly.
Well, did they say how much time?
Less than a minute, I think, was the testimony,
that
Your
was their
Honor.
testimony.
Yeah, they saw that it was closed, turned around, started walking the other way. Now, the other thing so Mr. Forte's pro se representation resulted in him not using the Mass Mutual video effectively at all when it was available to him. Now, of course, he was being held in custody pre-trial. Special arrangements had to be made for him to see this video, and he saw it right before the trial, before he had a time to really digest it.
Wasn't the video certainly available to him and his, I don't remember which number, counsel, at the
Yes.
at a motion to suppress?
It was,
3
Your
months
Honor.
before trial?
He hadn't seen it then. His attorney had. Mr. Brown was representing him then and did a good job at the motion to suppress.
But he was there.
He was there, and that was not played at the motion to suppress. But I think Mr. Brown had it and probably had seen it, although I think, I can't really say that, Your Honor, because I know there were special codes that had to be obtained from the prosecution before they could access the video and make it live.
Yeah, but wasn't wasn't part of the motion about that video? But wasn't that used by the defendant or by his
Yes.
counsel? So
Yes.
presumably, he must have seen it.
Presumably he saw it, Mr. Brown saw it at least. And you can see, even at that hearing, Mr. Forte is insisting on his right to represent himself. He's voicing objections to what's going on from the table where he's sitting next to Mr. Brown. And later, I think it's fairly clear from the record that Mr. Forte saw the Mass Mutual video with the assistance of standby counsel only right before trial began. Now, when you
Now,
look
with regard to this, I mean, we can't find him to be ineffective.
No, Your
Because
Honor,
ineffective
no.
assistance of counsel is a denial of your right to counsel, but he has an equal right to represent himself, no matter how foolish that might be. So
I'm not suggesting that you should find him ineffective, Your Honor. I'm saying that his handling of the case produced a substantial likelihood of a miscarriage of justice.
But that
aside from
would, that
his
would
effectiveness.
require us to find that, essentially, that we think there's a reasonable doubt, because you can't challenge his handling of the case, because he has a right, however foolish he may be, to
I'm not challenging.
himself.
I'm not challenging his handling of the case, Your Honor. I'm just trying to bring to the court's attention how his handling of the case left outside of the evidence things that I think competent counsel would have raised, and this court is, I think, under 33E certainly authorized to consider.
Didn't leave outside the evidence. It meant he didn't highlight it, but
Yes.
I gather the video was an evidence.
The video went into the evidence, and the main, what happens is, this is the other thing I want to talk about Mr. Forte's handling of the case, Your Honor, is that he notices the court that he wants to call in his own case Torres and Vasquez. And then he cross-examines those two witnesses when they testify. It's only after they testify that the Mass Mutual video comes in. Now, this is like a 2-day trial. This was not a lengthy proceeding. After the Mass Mutual video comes in, he tells the court that he'd like to call these women in his own case. And he wants to examine them about their identifications of him from the defense perspective. Now, he doesn't really make much of a record on that. And so I'm raising this issue as well on substantial likelihood grounds. But the judge denies it and won't let him call those women as witnesses in his own case, saying that, well, what are you going to do? You're just going to revisit what you've already done with them on cross-examination. Now, Mr. Forte's view is that that deprived him of his right to put his own case on, because he wanted to do more than just undermine these witnesses and through cross-examination, as they were part of the government's case. He wanted to present them affirmatively in his case so that the jury could see that this was really central to what he was saying happened here.
Yeah, but he's got standby counsel. They have an interest in not, I mean, you would agree that if counsel were to ask, were to do exactly what he did, you would not be making this argument.
I think I would. It would be fashioned as an ineffective assistance claim.
Because he hadn't done it before, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it would be. But like Judge Gantz points out, I can't charge.
No, you
Mr.
can't,
Forte
but-
can't charge
well,
himself
that-
with being
but-
ineffective. But
No-
I can raise whether or not a likelihood of a miscarriage of justice has resulted from what went on in this trial. Now, among the things that Mr. Forte, would or should have done if he had not been barred from recalling these witnesses, or if he had understood properly the rules of evidence regarding the expansive scope of cross-examination, is he would have examined them about the Mass Mutual video, which had come into evidence, unfortunately, after they had testified in the government's case. Because when you play that video, and this is evident too in the stills that were taken from the video, the women who say that they were right across State Street from Mr. Forte as he was about to cross in front of Crown Fried Chicken are not there. They are not where they say they were. They say that they were anywhere from like 8 to 20 feet away from him,
May I ask you,
and they are simply not there.
you're not there in the Mass Mutual tape, but are they there in the Crown Chicken tape?
No, the Crown Chicken tape is it's a security video that just covers the front of the store, kind of, and it shows him more or less coming down the street, and that's all it shows. I think it's about maybe 15 seconds long, Your Honor, and it's only aimed in one direction, which is northward. They say they were approaching from the south as he was traveling south, and that they saw him as he was just about to cross State Street, and they were, like they said, 8 to 20 feet about to cross themselves away from him. And it was when they saw him there that they then went across Main to the other side of the street to avoid him. But this, of course, the tape comes into evidence, but it's not made effective use of by Mr. Forte through his own fault. But the question is, if they're not there, who did they see?
Well, Ms. Robertson, and I'm not going to remember the details, but there was a description of the seconds of the frames on the Mass Mutual tape she can obviously speak for herself, but I thought the argument of the Commonwealth is that actually that's not correct, what you're saying.
Well, a police officer says, oh, I can see them there, but that's why I think you should look at it yourself. And if, in effect, if Mr. Forte hadn't been handling this case, I think any attorney would have said, do you see them? Because you don't. And again, obviously Mr. Forte can't charge himself with being ineffective, but it does give rise to a substantial concern about whether justice miscarried here. So the other thing, again, this is in the second volume of the evidentiary hearing regarding the motion to suppress when Mr. Forte had counsel. A question is put to Ms. Vasquez, one of the principal testifying recipient witnesses here, about the second sighting of this person as he's washing his hands in the street. And the question is, this is at page 220 of that volume. The question is, and you couldn't see his face, could you? No. Could not see the man's face on the second sighting.
but
that was never used by Mr. Forte at trial.
But there was the hair.
Yes, he had hair, but even the hair is wrong. The description that's provided the police, and this is where you can use the Crown Chicken video in a way that Mr. Forte didn't. This description provided by these women to the police is that the person they saw had white, bushy hair and
Blonde and gray,
and a beard, okay? When you look at the Crown Chicken video, which is allegedly of the person that they saw, at least that's what the government's theory was, you can see Mr. Forte that has darkish hair, it's not bushy, it's not particularly white, and he doesn't have a beard. And the other thing that they said was that the person they saw was in his 40s. Mr. Forte at the time was 55 years old.
But
So-
they're in their young 20s. I mean, I'm not
Everybody
gonna go-
looks old, yeah, sure.
Got it.
But so there's all these things that weren't done, that were available and in the record, and they're here before the court in making your assessment as to whether a substantial risk, a substantial likelihood exists,
He
and
did have on a black shirt with white stuff and tan pants, right?
he did. He did. Yes. Now, another question that's raised in the brief is whether or not the evidence here was in fact sufficient under the law, and I'd suggest that it was not. It proves, the evidence in the light most favorable to the Commonwealth was that Mr. Forte was seen on the street twice, that he was in proximity to the decedent, but not in that close a proximity, and that he had turned his T-shirt inside out the next morning after spending the night in the rain. And that's basically their case. There was no...
Was seen washing his hands?
That's the second sighting, Your Honor, yes, that he's in the street, and they say that that was the same person that they saw earlier in front of the Crown Chicken. I'd suggest that, you know, there's no admissions, there's no blood evidence, there's no weapon, there's nothing other than what I just said connecting him to this man who was murdered on a street corner in the dark at 3 a.m. in Springfield.
Well, if there were evidence that the man who was washing his hand in a puddle right next to the man whose throat had just been slashed, you agree that would be sufficient?
I think that overstates the evidence, the government's evidence. I don't think he was right next to the man. He was in the street, evidently, and this little alcove at what was then Chapin's store at the corner is some distance, I think, from where Mr. Forte was arguably
Well,
seen.
isn't it, the alcove is it's a convex alcove, right? No, concave.
Concave alcove, yes.
But it's in or on the sidewalk, right?
It's on the sidewalk at the corner of Bliss and Main Street. So, you know, whoever is there could be accessed by someone coming from Bliss as well as from Main. And again, viewing the evidence in the light most favorable to the government, Mr. Forte's mere proximity on this second sighting to the person who later found to have been stabbed to death is not sufficient to convict him of this crime. The other evidence that they used to, I say, prove Mr. Forte's identity as the killer in this case was bad act evidence. They put in 4 separate incidents of Mr. Forte losing his temper earlier that day and threatening violence. There was no violence actually committed during any of these, and they used that evidence to prove that he was, in fact, because he was wandering around all day losing his temper, the man who had killed Mr. Donahue.
It was also admitted for state of mind, yes?
That's what the judge says, and she instructs to that. But there's the killer's state of mind here was never really an issue.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, why would someone kill a homeless person? What was their state of mind? Was there any explanation? Yeah, he was acting violent and crazy within hours of this, threatening to kill people. I mean, that's sort of relevant to motive, right?
I think that given the state of the evidence, all that this proved was the identity of the killer, and the judge's attempt to limit it with instructions like that would have been less than efficacious. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you.
Good morning, Your Honors. Excuse me, Catherine Robertson on behalf of the Commonwealth. And with all due respect, I'm going to differ with Mr. Nixon on some points with respect to what the record showed about the content of the Mass Mutual footage, surveillance footage, and the descriptions that the witnesses gave, and what they said they saw. I think with respect, with respect to what I'll call the Vaughn issue, which is the claim that the Mass Mutual footage really exonerates Mr. Forte. You know, the Commonwealth's position is that we're really in the arena of the Wynn case, where the court was faced with footage, surveillance footage, that's just not really clear on the point that the defendant wants to rely on, for the purpose for which the defendant wants to rely on the footage. So, but specifically, I think what the court would need to focus on is the footage that occurs around from about 3:11 to about 3:14. That's really that's the point of time at which the witnesses are. That's the point of time at which the figure that the Commonwealth said was most likely the defendant's figure, that crosses in front of Crown Chicken at about 3:12:09. At about 3:12:0 and 3:12:01, the police officer who played the video at trial said, "We see a figure," and the police officer described it as a female figure, and in closing, the prosecutor, the district attorney, argued that inferentially that was one of the witnesses.
In which video is that?
That is in the Civic Center Mass Mutual video, which is a full half hour.
Okay, so you've got the Crown Chicken video, that's where he's
Yes.
apparently seen, and then you
Yes.
have the Mass
Mass
Mutual
Mutual
video where the officer says he sees the image of someone he
Right.
believes is a woman.
The Crown Chicken video is really only about 30 seconds long. I mean, that's a guess, but it's a brief duration. It was Exhibit 5 at trial. It was put in through Yvette Torres, who was the first of the precipient witnesses to testify. It's, I can't remember, but it's in the Commonwealth's appendix. We've included a copy of it. That shows only the defendant, and it's brief. The surveillance footage from Mass Mutual is a camera that's on a loop that kind of pans down Main Street, then back up Main Street, and a little bit north, and then back to the United Bank. So it makes a circle. So there are points in time when it's not recording, the spots on the loop.
So the camera itself is moving?
Well, I don't know if the camera is moving, but it's shooting different spots.
It must be.
I guess it moves. I don't know how a camera like that actually works, Your Honor, but it's not covering the whole area. At the same time, it pans around, is what the police officer said, and you can see that it jumps. It jumps from sort of scene to scene. But the witnesses testified in terms of exactly where they were when they saw the defendant, when they crossed the road from the west to the east side of Main Street to where the United Bank was, it varies a little bit. And they contradict themselves to some extent. There are discrepancies in their descriptions of exactly where they were. We're talking about a short city block, Bliss Street to State Street. There are points in time where at the suppression hearing and at the trial, where you can read their testimony to say, we saw him when he was somewhere between Court Square, which is actually not on the map at page 39 of the record appendix. It's further north.
Further north on Main Street.
Further north on Main Street. So we saw him in the block between Court Square and the Crown Chicken Restaurant, which is actually exactly on the corner of State Street and Main Street. There are times when you can read their testimony to say, and we crossed Main Street sometime between Bliss Street and State Street. One of the witnesses stopped while she was crossing the street and had an exchange with the defendant. Nobody is asked whether he or she, sort of proceeded directly on or...
Do you mean defendant or victim? I'm sorry. The exchange. I'm sorry.
The defendant. She had an exchange with the defendant. She cursed back at him.
Oh, I missed that. Okay.
Yeah, no, there is one of the witnesses, and I think it's Ms. Vasquez, says she turned around and she cursed back at him while she was crossing the street, in the middle of the street. So no, both of them have one of them has an exchange with the victim, but one of them also has an exchange with the defendant. She curses back at him. So they're, exactly, they are, as Your Honor, they are 19 and 20 at the time of trial. The trial was almost 2 years after the murder. They're not precise about where they are in this short block when they cross the street. So it's really not dispositive that, there are two sort of shots that don't show them sort of immediately adjacent to that corner. The next shot does appear to show a figure. Police officer says it's a female figure. Prosecutor argues it's probably one of the witnesses. We know that about a minute later, they're both across the street and near the bank. But there are times in that 13 to 14 minutes, 3:13 to 3:14, when you only see one of those figures, when you can't tell if you see two of those figures. It's just not very clear. The footage is not very clear. The Commonwealth argued that it was wholly consistent with the witness's account. The witness's account of what occurred was that they saw an angry man wearing a black T-shirt, dark pants, white writing on the front, white
Dark
writing on the
pants or
back.
tan pants?
Tan pants. I'm sorry if I misspoke. Dark T-shirt, white writing on the front, white writing on the back, which they saw when they looked at him from the other side. That he had blonde to grayish hair. There was no question of a beard. That I think Mr. Nixon is remembering. He has a mustache. It's fair. He has a mustache. They did not say they saw a mustache. They didn't say one way or another whether there was facial hair. In the description that they gave immediately after, before they ever saw any video, before they ever saw any photographs, they said white to blondish, gray to blondish hair, shoulder length, stringy or bushy or frizzy or crazy. They said sort of medium height, 5'7", 5'8", 5'9", stocky build. They said the dark T-shirt, they said the tan pants. He had a distinctive way of walking, and you see that in the video. That was the description that they gave immediately to the first responders. That was a description that the police relied on. And that was the description of the defendant. That description is confirmed by pre-murder video recording from Tower Square, which is about another 2 blocks north of the location of the murder. So there's video from Tower Square at 8 p.m. on the 26th, and there's video from Tower Square at about 8:30 a.m. on July 27th. And you see the black shirt, the tan pants. In the morning, you very clearly see the face. So there's really other people other than these witnesses identified this defendant from the Crown Chicken video. So it's not the typical ID case where we're relying only on what these two eyewitnesses saw. In terms of whether somebody else could have done it, I guess the first thing I would say is that, the Commonwealth's not required to disprove sort of every other possible scenario. What I do think the Mass Mutual video shows is that the witnesses were accurate in saying there was nobody else there. It shows a few people. It shows a couple of other people on Main Street. This is 3 a.m. on Main Street in Springfield. It shows one other figure at about 3:08 who appears only sort of near the Mass Mutual Center. Nobody, nobody south where the witnesses were. It shows cars. It shows a couple of people inside the Crown Chicken restaurant at around 3:01 or 3:02, pretty early. But otherwise, you don't see other figures on the street. So you would have to hypothesize, somebody that's not at all captured in this footage as the person who committed the murder. One of the witnesses said they got to the corner and turned around right away, to your question, Your Honor. The other one said they milled around on the corner for a couple of minutes. That's consistent with the Mass Mutual video, that they were there for at least, 1 to 2 minutes. Then they saw the same person who had cursed at them washing his hands in a puddle, and that puddle is no more than 3 feet away from the alcove, in the street, but no more than 3 feet away from the alcove. So he's there. The man they saw and who cursed at them, who is the defendant, is there immediately adjacent to the alcove where the victim was, immediately after the murder. There's very little time for anybody else to be there. There's really, it's conceivable. It's extremely unlikely. With respect to the other unless there are other questions about this sort of concatenation of evidence.
No, I do have a question on something else. Was there any inquiry into the competency of Mr. Forte to represent himself?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, the judge was very careful. She looked at Commonwealth versus Means. She had an and there are transcripts of 2 hearings that she held on his competency to represent himself. She had, a fairly extensive colloquy with him about her concerns about his representing himself. She referred him to the court clinic that's connected to Hampden County. He was interviewed, and he had been frequently seen, and you can tell that from the transcript, he had been frequently seen at the court clinic in connection with competency for trial on past occasions. He had a lengthy conversation with, I think it's a psychologist, but don't hold me to that, who testified at a competency hearing in connection with his representation of himself, and who said it is not the function of a mental impairment. It's a function of his experience with the system. He has a firm belief that anybody who's represented to him won't present his case the way he wants to have it presented. It's not a function of a mental impairment. So she looked very carefully at Commonwealth versus Means, and she complied with Commonwealth versus Means at one of this court's cases. I mean, it wasn't a question of him waiving counsel, but he did waive counsel. It wasn't a question of him forfeiting counsel the way it was in Commonwealth versus Means by his conduct, but a deliberate waiver of counsel, and she inquired into that very thoroughly as well. With respect to the prior conduct evidence, that's another area where I think the judge was, it was a very experienced trial judge, it's Judge Sweeney, was very cautious in her approach to whether or not she would admit the evidence. The Commonwealth moved in limine and cited a number of cases, and she acknowledged that this was a close question. She did not decide before opening statements. She did not decide until after, in the afternoon of the first day of trial, after review, and the first 2 witnesses had testified. She allowed standby counsel to argue this motion in limine rather than having Mr. Forte argue it, because she said it is very important, it is critical. The Commonwealth, it's a question that's committed to her discretion. She has pretty broad discretion. It's not an error unless it's a palpable error. The Commonwealth relies on Commonwealth versus Scott. I think Commonwealth versus Bradshaw is also instructive in this regard. In Commonwealth versus Scott, the court affirmed the admission of evidence of other assaults on 2 women in the 2 and 3 days preceding a murder to show sexual frustration as a motive for a murder that seemed to have sexual overtones. In Commonwealth versus Bradshaw, the court affirmed the admission of evidence of the defendant's actions on the day before the murder, sort of leading up to the murder, to explain the motive for this murder. And this was really a senseless murder. This was a homeless man. He was settled in for the night. He had no defensive wounds. There was no robbery. There appeared to be no reason why anybody would have injured this person, stabbed this person twice, once cutting his carotid artery. So why this happened was a live issue at trial. How this, and the district attorney, in closing, argued, you need to look at this in context. During the day, during the 16 hours leading up to this murder, the defendant had threatened to kill people at 2 of these incidents, one at Providence Hospital, one, completely unprovoked at Stop and Shop, where he's looming over another customer at Stop and Shop and saying he wants to kill someone. He wants to kill someone. And 2 other incidents where he seems to display bad temper that are perhaps sort of less violent and less indicative. But on 2 occasions, he's saying he wants to kill somebody. And that's, again, this is very temporally, it's very, very closely tied to the murder. There's no evidence of his conduct, on other occasions, on other days, and other years. There's no evidence of any other contact he's had with the criminal justice system. This was, as I said, this was strictly temporally limited. Unless the court has other questions, the Commonwealth will
Counsel.
rest on its brief.
Thank you.